Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever anybody is. We welcome you and we're very glad to have you with us today. I am personally also, to echo what Ben said, very excited about this conversation with my friend Tom Hardin, and I'm happy to call him a friend. We're going to talk a little bit about how Tom and I met. It was very serendipitous and related to what we're going to talk about here. But very briefly, Tom Hardin grew up in Georgia and was the first of his generation to go to the Ivy League. He was an ambitious young man, which followed him into his career and saw him rising through the ranks of the financial services industry. In the late 2000s, he was a rising hedge fund analyst when he was essentially tapped on the shoulder by the FBI, wanting to understand some trades he made. And that changed his life. Ben mentioned he was involved with the FBI on outing individuals regarding insider trading, doing the country a service in that respect. And we'll get into that whole story, which was quite an ordeal for Tom and his family to go through. And what I particularly admire about Tom is how he's turned that extremely difficult moment in his life into something that he learned from, that he grew from, and that he now shares with others, both to help them improve aspects of their life, and then has also dug in when it comes to ethics, decision making, communication strategies, and has made himself into a deeply useful consultant, speaker, trainer to corporate executives. And as someone who does a bit of that myself, I truly believe in what Tom talks about here. So I'm really excited for this conversation. Tom, how are you today?
Doing great. Thanks so much for having me on, Jeremy. Looking forward to the conversation.
My pleasure. And I realized as I was describing you, I didn't mention a big aspect of it that Tom's book came out recently, Wired on Wall Street. It's officially a bestseller. Tom is a very busy guy at the moment. He's in demand, traveling around the country, meeting with Anthony Scaramucci, who we've had here before, and others. Seems like everybody wants a piece of Tom, so we appreciate you making time for us. Let's jump into things, Tom. We have a lot to talk about here. And I want to start by talking about what is essentially a fateful day on July 8th, 2008. It was a busy morning in Midtown. You heard your full name said by someone you didn't know, which I've heard you say would only be said by, say, your mother, maybe. Tell us about that morning, what happened, and what led up to that moment.
Yeah, it was a Tuesday in early July 2008, so middle of the financial crisis. I was doing one of the most unremarkable things a person can do in Manhattan. I was dropping off dry cleaning on 8th Avenue, half a block from my apartment. I was thinking about the markets. It was a tough time, but nothing I couldn't handle, or so I told myself. And then, as you said, Jeremy, I heard a voice on 8th Avenue right behind me say, "Are you Thomas Covey Hardin?" And you mentioned I grew up in Georgia. Back when we heard our full name like that, you were usually in trouble with your mom. It wasn't my mom in Manhattan. I turned around and two FBI agents, straight out of central casting, male and a female, dark suits. We'd like to, could you come sit down with us? So they walked me. It was a Wendy's next to the dry cleaner. The upstairs was empty. We sat down. The male agent, slid a sheet of paper across that sticky table at Wendy's, and there was two big circles at the top. And in the book, I called them the Great Whites. Their names were whited out, but I knew who they were. And I was a tiny name at the bottom, so the minnow, the bait fish. And he asked me, are you aware of insider trading going on? I said, yes, it's rapidly happening. He says, you have the opportunity to help us. It's going to help you out, Tom. And I took his card and said, well, should I talk to a lawyer first? And the FBI said, we'll let you know when you can do that. So I took his card, and the way I got to that booth, was really the whole story of the book, Wired on Wall Street. As you mentioned, grew up middle class in Georgia, first of the family to leave the South, Ivy League school, Penn, started working in the hedge fund business. I was a junior partner by 2006 at this hedge fund, seeded by a legend in the industry, Julian Robertson. I became aware insider trading was happening in the industry. That's no excuse for what would happen next. The next sort of 7 months of 2007, I received four stock tips from another investor, placed four small trades in my portfolio, told myself the story of many rationalizations. It feels like everybody's doing it. I'll do it just this one time. But again, I always make the point that cheating is a choice. Just because it felt like many people were doing it, I chose to cross that line. And so my personal stake, which we'll get to later, was quite small relative to my career. And so when I tell this story today and in the book, I'm really walking through how this middle class kid who mainly followed the rules his whole life ended up in a booth at 6:30 in the morning at Wendy's being asked to wear a wire.
Quite a story. Before we continue, I also want to mention that as you're listening to members of the audience, if you want to ask a question to Tom, you can go ahead and put that in the chat, or I guess it's the raise hand function, or wherever you can put a question in. I'm sure you will see it. But please do think about that, and I'll remind you as we go. But let's talk a little bit more about the current moment now, and what happened after that, and how you're telling your story, because you're telling it via the book and talks to a wide variety of audience. You've learned a lot with what you've been through, and you have, as I mentioned, a lot of valuable lessons to share. But I think what we're talking about here, the roots were laid early in your career in finance. And I noted in your book, a senior person asked you to revise a document and told you, don't lie, just omit. No, excuse me, don't lie, don't, I'm saying this wrong. Let me try again. Don't lie, just omit, frame, polish. This is how things get done. So, looking back, was there anything you could have done differently in that moment? Or was it just kind of so baked into the culture that pushing back would have cost you everything? And I'm curious what lessons people should draw here when they feel subtle pressure to compromise their ethics.
Yeah, that moment or some version of it, I think, it happened years ago with me, but it's still very evergreen. It happens to almost everybody in finance at some point. And mine was as a young analyst in my first job out of college at an investment bank, working on deals during the dot-com bubble. And I'd watch senior bankers adjust numbers in my financial model in ways that wasn't technically breaking the rules, and they'd sell you, so themselves, right? They weren't lying, they were framing. That was a big thing. They were polishing. They were choosing which line item got highlighted in the presentation to our client and which one got buried in the footnote. And the message I absorbed, 22 years old, without anyone saying out loud, was, this is how grown-ups do it. This is the job. And could I have pushed back? In theory, yes. I guess in practice, at 22 years old, with a big student loan and the feeling that I'd spent my whole life trying to earn my way into that building, no, I wasn't going to push back. And I want to be candid about that, because I think we do a disservice when former wrongdoers, such as myself, get on a stage and pretend they were, one conversation away from blowing the whistle. I wasn't, and I was trying to belong. And as far as people listening, the pressure that you feel, to omit, to frame, to polish, it's never one dramatic ask. It comes a hundred small sort of normalizations over years. And someone senior reframes something in your presence and doesn't get struck by lightning, right? Then a peer does it, then they get promoted, and you see that. Then you do it yourself, and a little, and it's fine, and nobody says anything. And then by the time a clearly wrong thing is sitting in front of you, as they got to later in my career, and your moral reflexes, I think, have been trained on 10,000 reps of this is just how it's done. So I think one of the lessons is today, like, it's not, be a hero in your first meeting. I think the lesson is, when I talk to young people, pay attention to the direction of traffic. If you notice that the stories you tell yourself about your own work are getting more euphemistic over time, we're just being aggressive. Everybody does this. It's a gray area. That is the signal. And so the language, I feel, is often the leading indicator. Long before anybody, wears a wire, they start using softer words for harder things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I want to talk about what you've referred to as kind of the slow drift. And I have kind of a few part question related here, because even surrounded by that environment and watching people succeed, through some questionable choices in ethics, this didn't happen with you all at once. It was, as you noted, a slow drift. It was a series of small decisions, right? So can you walk us through the first time you crossed that line and what you told yourself to make it okay? And I'm also interested in what you write about with moral licensing, the idea that doing something good gives you permission to do something bad. Curious a bit on how that works for you. And then one more part of this, if you forget it, I'll remind you. A question people want answered over, these illegal trades. You referred to this earlier. Your fund made about 1.2 million. If you can wrap this question up by talking about what you made, and despite this deeply impacting your life, how that worked, that would be interesting as well.
Yeah, to set it up, it's 2007. I'm at my final hedge fund where I'll be working. We lost money in the first quarter. We were investing over a 3-year horizon initially, but losing money in the first quarter. My boss comes into my office, closes the door, and says, "Okay, forget investing over 3 years. We have to make money every month, or we may not survive." again, I didn't push back in that conversation. I didn't ask him to clarify that ambiguous message. So for people listening, leaders, like ambiguity like this is kind of the enemy of ethics, the enemy of integrity. When there's this ambiguous message and you don't clarify it, that plays a huge part. And so he knows, quote, people are doing this, making these trades. And it's only a few months later, I receive a tip from another investor, a woman who would work for Roger Rotnam. He's one of the two big guys the FBI was going after. Just a blatant tip. She tells me that she has a cousin whose roommate works at Moody's, and he mentioned that there's a public company that's going to be acquired in a few weeks. Here's the date, here's the price, here's the PE firm. Like a totally explicit tip. She was always full of rumors. Rumors move stocks. I'd always call her, "What's moving this stock today?" And so that's why I stayed in touch with her. But I suspected she was doing this. She gives me this tip. My first instinct, I guess, to my mild credit, was I'm not touching this at first. Talked to her, but later that day, I was catching up with a friend. He's losing money. He says, "Are you hearing anything out there I can trade?" I pass it along to him. If you want to trade this, here's what's happening. Just right there, I'm sure most people know I've now exposed myself to being charged with insider trading just for tipping. He tells his whole firm they're loading up, and then every day the stock's ticking up. He calls me back and he says, "Dude, did you buy some?" And as the junior partner at my firm, I could buy a stock in our portfolio and not have to talk to my boss as long as it was less than 1% of the assets we manage for clients. I remember calculating and buying a 0.9% position in the portfolio in Kronos. And I thought if my boss had a problem, he'd say something. And I totally rationalized it. Everybody's doing it. I'm not hurting anybody. You mentioned moral licensing, and that's a term I actually found through researching the book, all this behavioral psychology. I'd heard a lot of it, but not this term. And moral licensing is really the way I describe it today is kind of the trick your brain plays on where every good thing you do becomes a coupon you can redeem later against a bad one. And it's really insidious because most of us don't think of ourselves as ledger keepers, but in the background, we absolutely are. And for me, it ran constantly. I'm looking around at my competition and tell myself these guys are blatantly doing it and they're making 10 times what I'm doing. And I'm the honest one. I'll just take a small position. I'll just take a flyer. And that's the actual moral licensing. So the presence of worse actors actually gives you the permission slip. Um, Sort of the practical version I give today and share with companies, if you ever catch yourself thinking, I deserve this, or after everything I've done, a little bit is fine. That's the moral licensing talking, and that's the fudge factor negotiating with itself. And so you should just name it when you hear it on your teams or within yourself. And your final part of the question, Jeremy, over the four illegal trades, my fund made over $1 million. We managed $100 million for clients. So these four illicit trades were 1% of performance. It's pretty shocking, but we were up 31% that year. We were up 30% without the illicit trade. So what is the point? This is what people always ask me. And my personal take of the 1.2 million at 29 years old was $46,000. Not 46 million, not 4.6 million. $46,000 at 29 years old was the price of my career. And that's the number I have to stare at the rest of my life.
Yeah, I've heard that. Every time I hear you share that, it's very powerful. The cost of it, of what you went through, is right there. So that's quite powerful. I'm starting to see some questions come in, so please keep those coming. Thank you very much. I want to jump back into the story because, one of the things I love about the book, I really gravitate towards all these lessons on ethics. It's kind of a handbook on, ethical decision making, communication strategies. But honestly, it's also kind of a thriller, and you're the only person I've ever spent time with who I know wore a wire. So I think we need to spend a moment on that. Walk us through what happens after the FBI approached you. I know that they told you a little bit now you don't need to talk to a lawyer, which you've expressed a little ambivalence about afterwards. But how did it go from that morning in Midtown Manhattan to wearing a wire to get people who you knew to incriminate themselves? Tell us a little more about what that was like.
Yeah, so after the FBI met with me at Wendy's, they said I couldn't tell anybody other than my wife, and so I immediately violated that. I was for marriage, I had converted to Catholicism, and so a big sacrament in Catholicism is confession. So I decided to walk to St. Patrick's Cathedral that lunch that day and talk to the priest. And I remember thinking, wow, there's such a long line. Like how many other hedge fund guys are in line? But I got to talk to the priest, and I told him everything. And he's like, wow, your penance, for us Catholics, your penance is to help the FBI build these cases. Now, everybody listening knows I should have talked to a lawyer, but I at least talked to a priest. And so remember the agent called me and she said, I confessed to the agent. I just violated what you told me. I told a priest, and she's like, all right, that's fine. But I had to tell my wife, and that wasn't easy, but she took it as well as she could. And so really in this situation, it's pretty surreal. Like I met with the FBI the following week for lunch to sort of break down everything they wanted me to do. And they have a small piece of metal. So at the time, it was about an inch or two big on the table. And I was so naive. I said, "Is that a BlackBerry battery?" And they're like, "No, this is a body wire. You're going to have to build relationships with people, Tom, who are of interest, who might be of interest to the FBI." It was a pretty crazy situation as an informant because usually you have to think about, would I wear a wire on a friend who I had tipped? And so I didn't have to do that because the guy I tipped had worn a wire on me, and the woman who called me, I learned, had also done the same. So good friends. So basically, I had this open playing field, like who were the worst actors, and I would bring the FBI names. And my setup for the situation to get a meeting was it's 2008, probably going to lose my job, which is common for a lot of people. Then get a meeting with this hedge fund manager, and then start to get them discussing, who they are, build that rapport, and talk about their illicit trades. And I shared in the book, my first target was this hedge fund manager in Silicon Valley. I called him Mr. Silicon Valley, very, very creative, but I flew out, wired up at this Starbucks. And I was so nervous. People can read about it. I completely blew it. I was sort of chasing my own losses in the conversation. And I'd already told him about the deals I knew about the year before. And I dropped a line about this Moody's analyst. And then because I was panicking, I doubled down like with one of the worst sentences. There was this sort of group of people that were called the Mafia of Information, and they were like South Asian mafia. And so I'm like, I have a connection in this mafia, and the guy's looking at me like, how would you have that connection? So totally fumbled it. The FBI would listen to me later and say, "You're doing a terrible job, Tom." I said, "Well, there's my first time doing this. I wasn't trained for this." But over the next 2 years, I got less terrible, and the psychological toll, just to sort of end on this, it's hard to describe. Three people the FBI approached that summer, like me, killed themselves. The rate of suicide for FBI informants is 100 times higher than the general population. You're living a double life. You're trying to look normal to people. People are asking me, "How's the job search going?" Or like, "How's the markets treating me?" And like, terrible, but also that's not why. And the worst part for me is sort of when I got good at it. You start to be able to do it without even shaking. At some point, you have to ask yourself, what that means about who you are.
Yeah, that's all really powerful stuff. And it's a nice segue into the next segment. But I also want to say, I mean, I've also always been struck by the pressure that folks like yourself were put under. And I'm glad you're still with us because I know that you've been through some dark times. But I've also met your wife and kids, and they're pretty wonderful. So I see why you were able to pull through out of that difficult moment. But you're segueing into kind of an area that speaks to how we met. We actually met when Tom attended a talk that I gave. And I think, Tom, you'll describe this if I ever run, but I think he walked up to me and said something like, "I'm an FBI informant," or something like that. And
Yeah,
I've met a lot of
yeah.
FBI people. I detail in my book all the, elite members of government service, but I don't think I've ever met an informant. And I don't think anybody's ever told me that in 2 seconds. But would you talk a little bit about how we connected? And then let's talk a little bit about what we bonded over, the communication strategies that we both try to share with people.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting because I was sitting in the room when you were speaking, and it's rare for me to be at a conference and not be on stage. But it was one of these things where it was a good networking opportunity, and we, have several mutual people we know there. So I'm in the audience, and I thought, oh, this guy sounds interesting, sound like a spy, and then sat in your session, and then, oh my gosh, what you talked about, which we'll discuss, this is exactly what I was doing. And I went up and shook your hand, and I remember saying, "I'm an FBI informant." I mean, the previous FBI informant. Don't worry, I'm not wearing a wire now. So I was
Whoa.
just fumbling it, and at that point, Jeremy, when we met, I'd been sharing my story 8 or 9 years about the cooperation, but I'd never really had the language for what I was actually doing when I wore those wires. And I knew some meetings worked eventually and some didn't. And I knew some people, opened up to me, some of these targets, and some didn't. But I couldn't tell you why except by feel. So I'm sitting there listening to your story about the book, and you started walking through the tradecraft, the CIA officers use, the hostage negotiators use, verbal mirroring, elicitation, radical empathy, and the pieces just click for me. So that was pretty surreal.
Yeah, that was a cool moment. And I encourage everybody to buy Tom's book here. And if you do so, I'm flattered to say that he mentions that encounter and kind of, putting a name on some of the techniques he was using. He mentions the book, which I appreciate. But let's talk a little bit more about some of those communication strategies because I know some of those things resonated with you and you were actually using them in your work with the FBI. You essentially had to feel your way through this process and come to these methods yourself through trial and error. But out of that, fairly harrowing situation, you developed a few ways that you've personalized the methods I was talking about, and you now use them to help teams communicate better and improve how decisions are made. So tell us about some of those systems like the three meeting rule and trace. And I know they're quite relevant beyond just undercover work as well. So I look forward to hearing you share those.
Yeah, so let me start maybe with the three meeting dance. I call it. It's one chapter because it's sort of the simpler of the two, and it came out of sort of pure necessity. And so early on, I thought my job, as I mentioned, when I wore a wire, was to extract a confession, to get somebody to say the magic words in one meeting. And every time I tried that, I failed. As I mentioned in that meeting with Mr. Silicon Valley, I would push too hard. I asked on the nose questions. Nice to meet you. When did you start insider trading? And so I traded exactly the response that you talk about. So people are suspicious, they're cynical, they're defensive, and they totally shut down. So what I figured out over 48 recorded conversations is what people don't confess to strangers. They confess to the third version of someone they've already started to trust.
Yeah.
So I started pacing every target over three distinct contexts. The first meeting became almost always a phone call, so that's lower stakes. It's easy for them to walk away from. The second was usually face to face, somewhere public, feeling each other out. I know I mentioned Starbucks like 20 times in the book, but it was usually a coffee shop. And if I was lucky, the third meeting was where the real conversation started, when trust or the illusion of it finally clicked. And it took a while to get to that third meeting. There's a story I share in the book where I walk through that. Now, hopefully nobody listening to this is going to wear a wire, as we said, but I think, and feel free to chime in, Jeremy, I think every sales leader, every compliance officer, every board member has to had, they've had the experience of needing a real answer from someone who has no incentive to give it to you. So, you need to know if a critical hire is actually going to stay. I'm just thinking you need to know if a vendor is hiding a problem. You need to know if something rotten is moving inside your own organization that nobody's writing up formally. So you don't get there in one meeting. You get there by pacing, by showing up in my world three times, lowering the stakes, letting the other person calibrate you, and then being willing to go first yourself with a small vulnerability. And that's sort of the three meeting dance in my context in the book.
And then trace.
Trace is really this is my attempt to kind of take what you walk through in your book and kind of boil it down into something from my experience. So Trace is a framework, an acronym. So T is for time to silence. This was the hardest skill I would learn. Like I'd ask the target a question, and when they get right to the answer, the FBI would say, "You're doing a terrible job, Tom." I'd say, "Hey, it's my first time doing this." And so eventually they said, "Ask the question, don't fill the silence." And eventually people would start talking over the three meetings. The R is for reflect and let them talk. So instead of asking another question, kind of repeat the last few words they said, kind of with a small kind of upward inflection. That was sort of the mirroring that you talk about in your book. And A is for align and normalize. So you're not there to judge them, right? You're there to make the conversation, I think, feel like the most like natural thing in the world. And then C is for Q. So Q was subtle statements. So instead of asking, do you have a contact at that law firm, which gets you a no, you say, everybody's got their moles if they want to stay ahead. And you let, and I know you talk about this, Jeremy, but sort of that was where your idea of tendency to correct came in for me. Again, I'm just filling this out all on my own. And then E is echo and extract. So over the course of these meetings, you don't extract everything in one session. You kind of echo it back, and what you've heard across two or three contexts, and you let them clarify their own story over time. And really, I think for me, and patience is kind of that skill that nobody teaches you.
Yeah, that, I mean, obviously that all deeply resonates with me. And I think we could easily fill a session like this, just kind of going back and forth about these things. But what I can say, and I think it's relevant for everybody in the audience, is like you might pick up Tom's book and think it's a thriller or self-help, or you might pick up my book and think it's about sales. But really, there's life lessons beneath all of this. And I like to say life is sales. So many of the skills that Tom was engaged in as an informant are the same skills that, people in business development thrive using, and the same skills as Tom referenced that good board members exercise when they want to, exercise influence on people below them and not just command people all the time. And, building relationships. I always say to people that, people remember how you made them feel. And so that's kind of what I think about a little bit in that three meeting rule too, that, people need time to sort of build trust a little bit. But once people feel a sense of rapport, once people feel like they like you, they will quite often do rather extraordinary things for you and open up to you. And then there's all the things that you were just talking about with, which is in both of our books about how there are triggers to get people to talk a little bit more. You talked about the triggers for elicitation. Even, it's usually good for a laugh, but people are uncomfortable with awkward silences. And you kind of mastered that, I think, after trial and error. Putting something out there and then not rushing to fill those spaces can be a powerful way to learn a lot about a given subject. So again, I could go on and on here, but before I move on, Tom, anything else you think we should discuss there?
Yeah, I wanted to mention that when I was doing this over the phone, it was more
Yeah.
difficult. It might have been your book, Jeremy, or some other, when I was doing my research, that 55% of communication is body language. So, you lose that obviously over the phone. So I wasn't successful until I got kind of in person. If the third meeting was in person, I was pretty much good to go, after doing this several times.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. And I've heard the numbers vary is something that you wind up
Yeah.
hearing when you start digging in with psychologists or behavioral scientists on this. But I've heard numbers go up to 90% of communication is body language and tone of voice, and only 10% of the words. And I usually say, well, think about one sentence said in a calm, deliberate manner, and another sentence, yelled with your arms waving in the air. So as human beings, that's how we communicate. There's a lot about evolution that's done in that way. So it's really fascinating. There's a lot to learn there. And there are lessons on how to be patient and a better active listener that you can build on off of there. But maybe we circle back to this. But yeah, we could easily fill some time talking about it. But I want to get back to another question regarding wearing the wire that I think I'd be remiss to not ask. And I think I'm teeing up a certain encounter for you in Greenwich that reminded me of The Sopranos, if I'm not mistaken. But what was your scariest moment wearing the wire?
Yeah, so one guy high up the FBI's list, I got him in probably 15 conversations and he would say nothing. He'd always change the subject. He wasn't buying my trace method or my three meeting dance. He was on to me. And then one Sunday afternoon, he gives me a call and he says, Tom, we need to have dinner tonight. We need to talk. And I called the FBI and said, this guy who wants to all of a sudden have dinner. They got really excited. They met me at Grand Central, gave me the body wire. I took the train out to Greenwich to meet this guy. He picks me up at the train station and he says, Tom, good to see you. I brought swim trunks for you. We're going swimming at my mother's house. So the Sopranos final season was that summer. All these ideas were going through my head. I played it cool. I said, let's go swimming. We walked into this old mansion in Greenwich. He starts disrobing in this room. He wants to see if something's taped to my chest. Now it was in my front pocket. Now I'm about to have a heart attack, but I excused myself, went to the restroom, took the wire out, put it in my jeans, put these swim trunks on. So the two of us are walking out to this pool. It was so quiet. I saw a shovel against the house, a hole in the ground. I thought, oh my God, he's going to try to kill me or something. And he was having landscaping done. And we got in the swimming pool and he grabs a tennis ball and we're playing this awkward game of catch. And then after freaking me out, he said he spoke to an attorney and the attorney said, oh, this guy's definitely wired up. You have to ask him this one question. And so I said, what do you want to know? I was going to give it up. I was so scared. And he said, okay, Tom, have you been approached by the SEC? And I did something called paltering, where I said, no, not the SEC. He doesn't catch that nuance where I'm trying to help him. He starts confessing everything. Obviously, I'm not wearing a wire in the pool. This guy, I call him Mr. Greenwich in the book, he was never charged. And he was actually still managing outside money up until a few years ago. So he was one of the worst actors. They don't get everybody. But that was the scariest moment. And he never had me in for compliance training before he closed.
Yeah, wow, I love that story. The aspect of the shovel and the hole in the ground is just
Yeah.
like very
Uh,
cinematic. So,
yeah. Happy I got through it.
yes, indeed, indeed. So I
Yeah.
got a couple more questions, and then we are seeing some questions in the Q&A. They continue to come in. Please, keep those questions coming. Some of them are quite good, so I'm looking forward to them. But I want to talk about the personal side here because you write very movingly about this ordeal and how it impacted your family and your sense of self. Can you talk a little bit about that impact on your family and maybe some of the ways you pulled out of that dark period when your career was essentially destroyed?
Yeah, so the first arrest happened in the fall of 2009. By then, I had left my firm. Tipper X was the only name not released, and eventually the FBI was asking me to wear a wire on two people who I considered close friends. I drew the line there. This is going to go on forever. My lawyer, now I had a lawyer back then. He said, "Oh, this is risky." I said, "You can't do it. I have to stop." And so the FBI said, "Your name's coming out tomorrow." So that was on a Wednesday morning. My wife had just gone back to work that Monday from maternity leave, and so an emotional moment for any new mother, obviously going back to the office. So Monday, she's talking about our new baby to her colleagues. Wednesday, her husband's name is on the front page of the Wall Street Journal as the major informant. And so the one day she really only lost it, she came home from work that Wednesday. By then, I'm a stay-at-home dad, with the newborn, and she walks through the door. I mean, the phone's ringing, reporters are stopping by, and then she just takes Molly from my arms and goes in the corner and says, "I can't believe you did this to us." So that was the lowest moment I've ever felt in my life. I realized, I told myself the trades wasn't, weren't hurt anybody. I hurt anybody, in my orbit, my family, my wife. Now I'm a father. This is there going to be, implications for my newborn daughter. And so I realized, this was not a victimless crime, as people like to say. And so that was tough. Then, a few months after that, the hits just kept on coming. My father-in-law was diagnosed with leukemia, and it wasn't looking good. Maybe a few years. He was 66, definitely not going to make it to 70, and they were like another set of parents for me. And so I remember driving him, as a stay-at-home dad with Molly in the back seat to his chemo treatments. And one day he said, "Tom, you really hurt too, but you also have a chance to make it right." And that was one of the last conversations we had. My own sense of self, that sort of took longer. I was blacklisted, stay-at-home dad, became quite heavy, became technically obese. My wife, she saved my life many times. She signed me up for a 5K race. And so I started running. So any runners out there, it's great. You can clear your head. It's meditative. I got so into running. I was running what are called ultra marathons. So that's anything longer than, marathons, and got into that. And it really added structure to my day. Like there was so much I couldn't control. And I remember Jeremy and I had an event when I started in Barnes and Noble in New Jersey a few months ago when the book came out. I remember saying, don't read the self-help book in here, the section in here. They're like, don't say that. But it really didn't help. It didn't help me because self-help books made me think about myself. And so getting out there, running gave me structure to my day, and also just going and like just being of service to my church in our town, like helping other people gave me perspective. And so I did that for a few years because my professional future was unknown. But one other tenet that really helped me, the only thing I read that really helped me that stuck with me is the just sort of stoic tenets of you can only focus on what you can control. And there's a lot I couldn't at this moment because I hadn't been sentenced yet. But I just started thinking about, okay, what can I control? My health. So running was good for that, or being of service when I could. So eventually, I came out of that, but it took many years going through the shame spiral.
Yeah, and there's a lot more to say that Tom writes about movingly in the book. And then I just have one more question here before we open it up to some of the excellent questions that are coming in. But it builds on some of those kind of life lessons, which was really one of my favorite parts of the book. Some of the best insights of the book come out of this personal growth. And you write about the quote unquote integrity gap, the space
Mm-hmm.
between who we seem to be and who we actually are. And you also write that reputation is a shadow, character is the substance. I love that sentence. And you also refer to what you did as mistakes. No, you refuse to call them mistakes, rather. What's the difference, and how do you connect to your belief that the worst moments don't define you?
I get this question almost every time when I speak, and the word I won't let people give me back is mistake, as you mentioned. So mistake is when you spill your coffee, right, or when you do something by accident. So for years, what actually helped me feel not so bad about it, or just go on with life, is I told myself I made mistakes, and people told me that, oh, you made some mistakes and really paid for it. And then one day I was driving home from one of my first talks at the college. I said, you know what? I didn't make mistakes. I made bad decisions. And actually, if we call our bad decisions mistakes, we're not owning anything. So I think we all, probably no federal crimes, but we all make mistakes. We all make bad decisions, and we have employees that do both. And so how you treat a mistake versus a bad decision has to be handled differently. And so you want to have a culture where people can own their mistakes and their bad decisions, but you treat them and learn from both. But they're definitely two different things. And so you're going to see this all the time now. You'll see, just pull up the Wall Street Journal any day where there's an executive, being charged with something or some ethical story coming out. They almost always say, "Oh, I made a mistake," or "Forgive me for my mistake." It's never usually a mistake if it's on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. It's usually a bad decision. So that's something I had to work through. The integrity gap is something I came up in the book where, as a young man, I was so focused on my reputation, what people thought of me, what status I had. Clearly it wasn't about the money, the $46,000. It was more about, once I started getting tips, I was now in the in group who had the status, and that was like the people that had reputation. When clearly, people can hear that I totally neglected my character, and so there's this idea of a gap between what people think we are, our reputation, and what we actually are, like the decisions we make every day, and our character. And I had a massive gap because all those rationalizations I discussed to justify the trades are what kept that gap wide. So I encourage, audiences, when I talk today, to kind of figure out how far you're aligned from your reputation, your character, and really to close that gap. So it's interesting. People, will Google me, and the bad stuff comes up, and there's even reputation management firms that are out there, and they'll email me and say, we found some bad stuff, we'll clean it up for you. And I say, hey, here's tipperx.com, here's some more bad stuff, please don't take it off, right? So you have to actually own it. And so people will actually take all their stuff off Google or move it to page 10, but it was important for me to actually own it and try to close that gap. And so you really don't move on, just to sort of maybe finish on this idea. You don't really move on from a felony. It's tough. I have to live with constraints about where I can travel, what I can do, where I can have bank accounts, that type of thing. But you just have to move forward with it. You kind of let it be the thing that sharpens you instead of the thing that buries you. And the worst moment of my life, the day Sue came home and said, "I can't believe you did this to us." That's still the worst moment of my life, but it's no longer looping in my head like that was the shame spiral, and I'm not judging myself on being that person today. The guilt is still there, and that helps me sort of share this story with the next generation now. And I think it's the day somebody kind of taps you on the shoulder on a sidewalk in Midtown is not the day you want to start thinking about your integrity gap, right? So you want to think about it before then. And that's what I sort of encourage the audiences to think about today.
Absolutely, and you do important work there. The one that stays with me the most is that you shouldn't be judged by the worst thing that ever happened to you. And that regularly informs how when there are scandals and it's very easy to judge somebody going through something that did something terrible, and people have to be accountable for that. But people are more than their worst moments, as you very eloquently and movingly put. Let's talk about some of the questions here. I want to get to what we can here, and very specifically about the trades you were making. Someone asked, when you were actually making those trades, what did it feel like in the moment? You talked about this a little bit, but do you remember feeling
Uh,
excitement, pressure, rationalization, something else? Talk a little bit about the actual moments the trades happened.
yeah, no, great question. The tip comes in, as I said, I eventually, sort of I still have my moral compass. I don't do this. And then I, help a friend with it, quite the help. So now I've actually at least could be charged civilly by tipping that to him. So he's doing it. The stock is moving up every day. So the way I'm feeling before the trade happens in the days before is I'm getting a little bit of FOMO, like the stock's going up, call options are going off. And I start to tell myself, maybe it's actually in the market now. Maybe it's starting to be out there because the stock's moving up. And then my friend calls back and said, "Did you buy some?" And I remember calculating the 0.9% position I was allowed to buy in the portfolio. And so I pull up Excel, calculate 14,000 shares, and I put it in the order entry system. But it went very slowly over about 20 or 30 minutes doing this, thinking about it, put it into the order management system. And once it was filled, I committed fraud. Now, I didn't think, oh my God, I just committed fraud. But when it was executed, I remember looking at the door thinking like somebody's going to walk in, like nobody's walking in. So that was kind of where I was in my head. And but before the news became public, it still could be a rumor. She's always full of rumors. Maybe this isn't happening. There's these sort of rumors all the time. And then let's fast forward like 2 weeks later when it's actually public, and this is the first of four trades, and it hits the news wire. Now my first thought then was, oh my God, this is not a rumor. It's actually happening. Is my boss going to fire me? And then I go into my morning meeting with my boss, and we always review our portfolio before the stock market opens. And he's like, "Oh, Kronos is up 30%. Oh, it's one of those. Don't tell me how you're doing it." And so he's being willfully blind to my conduct. And so when I train leadership teams today, I talk about willful blindness or not asking questions about short-term performance and the importance of doing that. And then I started to feel an adrenaline rush. Like he's not going to fire me. He's actually okay with it. And now I have status as the young man to now be a part of that group that I wasn't. So those are all the dynamics beyond just the rationalizations that were going on with me, at that time. And the next conference I went to, I said, guys, I know about Kronos. And they're like, Tom, you do real work. You're Wharton, you do real work. I said, I do real work, but I also know about these trades. And now I know about the next one coming. And the guys with status put their arms around me and said, now you're one of us.
Wow. Really powerful stuff there. Really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. We've got a question that I'm glad we got because we've chatted about it. What's your opinion about the controversy around Kalshi and similar platforms?
It's all the questions I get today. It's crazy. It's interesting. The book landed right when this is sort of in the
Yeah.
news cycle. I don't know if I told you, Jeremy, I was speaking to this high school in Tennessee last week, and all the boys, an all boys school, all they were talking about was their sports betting, and like, how are you guys allowed to do this anymore? You're too
Yeah.
young, but Kashi prediction markets, and it really needs to be regulated. I think. One of the challenges right now is the regulator has been kind of slashed in terms of like just bodies in the office. Kashi and there's Poly markets. So Poly markets offshore that has to be done through a crypto wallet if you're an American. Not advice. That's how it's done. Kashi is an American company. The CFTC regulates the Kashi, and as far as I can tell, there's not a whole lot of people in the office right now in DC looking, or just the bodies aren't there to do this. But I think we do need to have some parameters around this. There have been a few cases. I think there was an employee for Mr. Beast who was charged. And I think sometimes when you don't have many resources as a regulator, you just have to sort of get cases that might just sort of be, something for people to look at and some names. So that was out there, but it's pretty much in our face now in the last couple of months, especially since the strike started in Iran. And I think about this as not just an insider trading problem. It's sort of in the world that you all are in, it's sort of this national security threat, right? If Iran sees there's a 90% chance we're going to strike them on a certain date, then that's a national security problem, not just an insider trading problem. So I would like to see some cases brought here. Personally, I think anything where you can bet where somebody knows the outcome, there's going to be insider trading. It's human nature. Feel free to bet on the weather next week, or and prediction markets are very good for economic forecasting. I think they're great there, and they're inputs to many hedge funds on that side of just like forecasting. But any event where somebody knows the outcome, there's going to be insider trading. And so I think there needs to be cases brought here of regular people and an actual like an enforcement kind of governance around this, because right now it's out there in our faces, and it's going to me sharing this story, and this it's out there. So I'd like to see some crackdown here.
Yeah, and it seems like some of these platforms are doing a little bit of self-regulation, maybe with the government. I don't know exactly, but I'm a baseball nut, and I know that they're now they've changed the ability to sort of bet on certain pitches, say. So,
Yeah.
because that
Hmm.
led to a lot of corruption. So, I think there's a lot of agreement in what you're saying. I just wonder if the money will follow there. And I want to invite you to also comment, just as a build there, on corruption in our current society. There's a lot of talk about corruption stemming from the White House, the timing of certain announcements in the market from this administration. I know you've had some thoughts. Could you share a little bit on that?
Yeah, and really through a nonpartisan lens, like myself,
Of
I'm an
course.
independent, so I vote across both parties every election, national, state, local. So this is not one side or the other, but just really last month, I think it was March 23rd on a Monday morning, where 6,200 oil contracts were shorted 14 minutes before a Trump Truth Social post about that things are looking better in Iran, so oil is going to trade down. So that happens, and so there's clearly somebody from the executive branch tipping, whether it's in the circle of the president or somebody else who we don't really know yet. But that type of thing can be easily flagged. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange, where oil trades through, all those trades are tagged. And if anybody at the CFTC wants to look at this, it's there. I mean, everything is tagged today. The technology is so much better today than sort of back in my day in tracking insider trading. So it's all there. And so one of the things in the State of the Union address when President Trump was talking about, he actually said, let's ban so just coming to insider trading in Congress. And the only time at the State of the Union Elizabeth Warren stood up to clap was actually that. So you think about bipartisan consensus of like Warren clapping for President Trump. It was around let's stop insider trading in Congress.
Yes.
25 bills have been introduced in the last 13 years out of the House into the Senate. They have never made it to a president's desk because there's always something in a bill. There's like 4 bills right now in committee. The issue with a lot of these bills is they make private business people who want to run for government actually have to sell their private shares. And so that's not what we're talking about. I mean, for me, I want like more private business people who have done well in the private sector to be willing to serve in the government, not career politicians. But this is the problem with these bills. And one of the other issues is the bill that has the best chance of surviving, the bill that I think is written the best. The president has said he'll veto anything if it restricts executive branch employees from trading. And I just think, okay, we have to do this for Congress, the executive branch, all three branches of government, because 86% of the country actually feels that people should not be allowed to trade single stocks if you serve in the government and Congress and the executive branch. And 86% of the country, I think we agree on daylight saving time going away, but that's it, right? So that's all. That's all we're focused on. So that's if giving a bigger platform with the book now. That's something that I've been pitching op-eds on.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, I want to encourage you once again to write about it and, reach out. We
Yeah.
can chat. But I'm in full agreement with you there. Let me turn to another question. It's from a lawyer who's a friend of the firm, and he is a Catholic. And so that resonated with him, a bit of your story as well. And he's interested in whether you've come to any epiphanies on whether avarice is just an inevitable feature of human nature, or whether we can take virtue and elevate it as a subject taught in schools to combat against avarice. So I thought it quite interesting to go from this, very
Yeah.
detailed stuff about Congress to, again, this more philosophical approach, which is an example of what I like so much about talking with you about.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, absolutely. I don't know if avarice is always sort of meant to happen, but I think we can elevate virtue. I think one of the challenges, the book is taking me more into schools now and colleges, which is great, which is what I had hoped to do with this, talk to the younger generation. The ethics classes are still taught, even in 2026, very philosophical. So deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, all those things from thousands of years ago, when we don't have as many ethics classes about like, okay, here's a case study on a young guy working on Wall Street telling himself everybody's doing it, or your boss walks into your office, closes the door, and says, now our KPI went from 3 years to monthly. And so what do you do then? Like the more the behavioral ethics side is what I, talk about in my trainings. And so I would like to see more colleges go that direction and like teach people, these are the dynamics. This is what you should do. This is how you should actually ask your boss to clarify these situations. So I think that in a way can elevate virtue in 2026. I think we need just sort of better examples to of people to follow. And so I have two young daughters. I say don't watch the Kardashians. Watch other people that are somebody that I want them to be like successful women in the world. But I think we have to get really back to like making ethics not just like, okay, I'm going to take my ethics class. Oh, now I have my finance class down the hall and ethics is on the other side of the building. Like, no, it's actually sort of in the case studies that we talk about across all classes and more the behavioral and not just like, if I taught a class adjunct, I would have the philosophy from Greece, the first lecture, and then everything else the rest of the semester would be, people like me coming in and sharing their stories. If I could get them and just talk about the behavioral side of that. So I think that's something that I would, focus on to kind of just re-educate people.
Yeah, I love that, Tom. And I think we have a moral crisis in America, and it starts with the administration, but it's reflective of the divisiveness in society. So I think it's so important the work that you're doing, going to schools and colleges and talking about ethics. So good on you for doing that. Just a couple more questions here as we're nearly out of time. One attendee asked that the swimming incident is a great example of things going off script. How much of wearing a wire is preparation versus improvisation when situations suddenly change? I think this is relevant beyond that narrow situation. We all involved in whether life situations, business, things go off script. Maybe you could speak to that just for a moment.
Yeah, no, things often went off script with the wire, especially as I got into a couple, meetings, repeat meetings with targets where we had our prep. Okay, I'm meeting this guy for dinner, or at this conference, and this is how it's going to go. And then really, as we talked about earlier, just sort of flying by the seat of my pants, eventually developing a framework I wrote about out in the book. But there was another guy in Silicon Valley who um, we met at a conference, and before we went to his house, we're going to his wine cellar. And it was earlier in my cooperation, so I was still way too direct, just trying to get a confession. And he turned to me actually in the wine cellar and said, "Are you wearing a wire or something?" And I had to pivot, quickly and say, "No, what are you talking about?" I said, "What did I look like, the FBI?" And just had to say that right in the moment. So it's so often like we can prep for things, but then we have to sort of take into account like things might change. Then one thing we started doing in these wire wearing prep sessions were pre-mortem. So I think that's important for any decision making. Like, okay, let's discuss, different types of outcomes on the decision tree or the outcome tree and what might happen, and then have our prep for that. So once we started doing that, I was a little, more well prepared about, okay, this wire wearing situation could go in a few directions. Let me just sort of think about what I might say in each of those directions. So that was more helpful.
Yeah, that's interesting. And someone asked also about the need for control actually increasing the risk of poor decisions and how to manage that. But I think you're speaking to that too. I like the idea of a pre-mortem as like a preparation. It's good preparation involves kind of trying to anticipate different variables and understanding that you might not anticipate every one of them, but understanding as much as you can about the situation and what could go wrong is key. I don't know if there's anything to add off of that, but yeah.
Yeah, I would say one more thing is just the 24-hour rule. So many times I'll speak to professional services firms like law firms and accounting firms, and the pressure for them is like coming from the client. Like, we need the answer now. And I think, if the relationship is solid, you can say, just give me 24 hours, I'll come back with the answer. So many times in these professions, people can cross the line because they're under that time pressure from the client. So I think the 24-hour rule is hopefully something we can all sort of use.
Absolutely. So let's just do one more question here, and then we'll wrap things up. But somebody was asking, how did you get people to meet with you, when you were involved in all of this? And that same person was wondering if you'd be so kind to refresh on what the T was in Trace because they missed it.
Oh, sure. So T is time to silence. So that was probably the most important thing, where I would ask the question and then say nothing, classic negotiation tactic or sales tactic. And then eventually the target would start talking. So that
Mhm.
was the T, time to silence. The cover story to get these meetings was, it was 2008. I'm a young analyst. I'd like to meet with this hedge fund manager. And so I'd network to get a meeting with the person who the FBI was interested in, and sit down and say, wow, how's the market treating you? Yeah, it's awful. Like 2008, it's the worst market in 75 years. We're getting killed. So to build that rapport, to build that empathy, and then, yeah, I'd love to follow up with you, next week. I have some ideas, and then have that phone call and say, I can't wait till this sort of market stabilize, because I had this guy last year, who knew about some deals, and I'm sure he'll come back to me. And, I know, you're pretty good with Intel, or, oh, not Intel, Cisco. Okay, thanks. Yeah. So then eventually by the third meeting, oh, so you have a contact at Cisco, and then get to that. But that was my cover story, to get there.
Cool. Well, Tom, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for the questions here. Sorry if we didn't get to any of yours, but I hope everybody has found this conversation as I have found interesting every time I speak to Tom and learn more about his journey. Is a lot to share. As I mentioned, Tom and I are working on potentially sharing an idea about working together on some of the communication strategies that we both speak about. We think it'll be a really dynamic session. Hopefully, some of you will be interested in potentially bringing us in to talk with your teams. There's a lot of great stuff to share. This is the first in this kind of seasons, if you will, series of webinar installments. We have one lined up. It is scheduled for May 20th. And tomorrow, all of you will receive an email from me where I will share a registration link. It's on the M&A Outlook in 2026. We have a partner from KPMG and the co-chair of K&L Gates as a part of that. These are practitioners who are very much down in the weeds on details. I'm speaking to them regularly, and they have incredible insights into the market to share. So I'm really looking forward to that. And reach out anytime if anybody in the audience has any questions about a project with Interfor or wants to learn more about Interfor Academy. We'd be delighted to hear from you. And I think that's about it. I want to thank Tom Hardin once again and encourage all of you to pick up Tom's book, Wired on Wall Street, and reach out to him or reach out to Interfor Academy if you want to book Tom to come in and have a talk with your team. So, Tom, thank you very much once again, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.